It was an autumn evening when the wind carried a biting chill, and the thick clouds threatened rain. Claire had just arrived in the small village of Ravenswood, where the townspeople still spoke in hushed whispers about Black Hollow Manor. Perched on a hill just outside the village, the manor had a dark and sinister reputation that had persisted for over a century. Claire had always been drawn to stories of the supernatural. As a graduate student of history, with a fascination for the paranormal, she had heard countless tales of haunted houses, cursed objects, and restless spirits, but none had intrigued her more than the legend of Black Hollow Manor. The manor had once belonged to the Hawthorne family, a wealthy but reclusive lineage known for their eccentricities. The family patriarch, Victor Hawthorne, was rumored to have dabbled in dark magic, and his mysterious death marked the beginning of the strange occurrences that plagued the manor. Over the years, there had been sightings of ghostly figures wandering the halls, strange noises in the dead of night, and inexplicable shadows moving in the windows of the long-abandoned estate. No one dared to venture near the place, and those who did rarely spoke of their experiences. Claire had come to Ravenswood to document the history of the manor and, if possible, spend a night within its haunted walls. She had arranged to meet with Mrs. Abernathy, the town's librarian, and the closest thing Ravenswood had to a historian. It was Mrs. Abernathy who had access to the old records and the stories that had passed down through generations. "Are you sure about this, dear?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, as she handed Claire a stack of dusty old documents. The elderly woman's voice wavered with concern. "Black Hollow Manor isn't just a place people talk about for fun. There's real evil there. People go mad after a night in that house. Some disappear altogether." Claire smiled, her curiosity and excitement barely contained. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Abernathy, but I've been studying haunted places for years. I've heard all the stories. I'll be fine." The old librarian shook her head, but she knew she couldn't dissuade the young historian. "Just be careful. If things feel wrong, leave. Don't let your curiosity get the better of you." Claire nodded, gathering the papers and heading back to the small inn where she was staying. That evening, she pored over the documents, learning about the Hawthorne family and the events leading up to the manor's abandonment. The deeper she dug, the more the story unnerved her. Victor Hawthorne had been an enigmatic figure, rumored to have been obsessed with immortality. It was said that he conducted bizarre rituals in the basement of the manor, attempting to summon something or someone from beyond. His wife, Margaret, had died under mysterious circumstances, and their only son, Alexander, disappeared shortly after Victor's death. The manor had stood empty for decades, except for the occasional brave soul who ventured inside. The stories from those who survived were chilling, footsteps echoing through empty halls, whispers in the dark, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched. Determined to experience the manor for herself, Claire packed her things the next morning and set out for Black Hollow Manor. The path leading up to the house was overgrown with weeds, and the wrought iron gates, rusted with age, creaked ominously as she pushed them open. The manor itself loomed large and foreboding, its windows like dark, empty eyes staring down at her. Despite the unease that crept over her, Claire took a deep breath and approached the front door. The air seemed to grow colder the closer she got, and the sky darkened as storm clouds gathered overhead. Claire hesitated for a moment, then reached out and turned the doorknob. It opened with an eerie groan, revealing the grand but decaying interior of Black Hollow Manor. The foyer was large, with a sweeping staircase leading to the second floor. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners. The smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic filled the air. Claire felt a shiver run down her spine as she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She decided to start her exploration by setting up her camera equipment and voice recorders, tools she often used in her paranormal investigations. As she moved through the house, setting up in key locations, the oppressive atmosphere of the manor began to weigh on her. It felt as if the house itself was watching her, waiting. By the time she had finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the dirty windows. Claire set up her sleeping bag in the large parlor, a room with tall, ornate windows that had once overlooked the gardens, now overrun with wild vines and dead trees. She lit a few candles, the flickering flames casting ghostly shadows on the walls. She began her investigation by speaking into her recorder. "This is Claire Richardson, documenting my first night at Black Hollow Manor. The house is in a state of severe disrepair, but there's a definite energy here. The air feels thick, as if the house is holding its breath. I'll be spending the night to see if I can capture any paranormal activity." As the night deepened, Claire explored the house further. She ventured into the basement, where the temperature dropped drastically. The air was stale and suffocating, and the faint scent of decay lingered. She had heard that Victor Hawthorne conducted his rituals down here, and the thought of it made her skin crawl. The walls were lined with strange symbols, faded but still discernible, and a large stone slab sat in the center of the room. A sudden noise from above made Claire jump. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the stairs. Her heart raced as she listened, trying to convince herself it was the wind or the house settling. But the footsteps grew louder, closer. Claire rushed back upstairs, her camera in hand. But when she reached the main floor, the house was silent again. She checked the footage, but nothing was out of the ordinary. Trying to shake off the growing sense of dread, she returned to the parlor and settled down for the night. The manor, however, had no intention of letting her rest. Just after midnight, she awoke to the sound of whispering. It was faint at first, like the wind rustling through leaves, but it grew louder, more insistent. The words were unintelligible, a low, guttural murmuring that seemed to come from all directions. Claire sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her voice recorder and began asking questions, hoping to capture something on tape. "Is there someone here with me? Can you make a noise? Give me a sign." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, heavy, and they seemed to be moving toward her. Claire stood, her breath shallow and fast. She scanned the room, but the dim candlelight barely penetrated the thick shadows. The footsteps stopped, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. She felt a chill creep up her spine, as if icy fingers were brushing against her skin. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, coming from the direction of the staircase. Claire's heart leapt into her throat. She grabbed her flashlight and cautiously made her way toward the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the grand staircase that led to the second floor. At the top of the stairs stood a figure. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face pale and hollow. His eyes were dark, empty voids, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. Claire froze, unable to move or speak as the figure slowly descended the stairs. His eyes locked on hers. She tried to back away, but her legs felt like lead. The figure continued to approach, its grin widening with each step. Claire's flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. She fumbled for her camera, trying to turn on the night vision, but her hands were shaking too badly. Just as the figure reached the bottom of the stairs, the temperature in the room plummeted. Claire could see her breath in the air, and the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. The figure stopped, its head tilting unnaturally to one side, as if listening to something only it could hear. In the faint glow of the dying candlelight, Claire saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Shadows began to writhe and twist on the walls, taking on shapes and forms that shouldn't exist. They stretched and contorted, reaching out toward her. Panic surged through Claire. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing loudly in the empty halls. She could hear the whispers following her, growing louder and more frantic. The shadows seemed to chase her, darting out from the corners of the rooms as if trying to grab hold of her. She fled to the front door, but when she grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. It felt as though something on the other side was holding it shut. Desperate, she slammed her body against the door, but it refused to open. A cold hand touched her shoulder. Claire screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. The air around her seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and she could feel the presence of something ancient and angry closing in. In a last-ditch effort, Claire ran to the windows, but they too were sealed shut. She was trapped. The whispers grew deafening, and the shadows on the walls writhed in a grotesque dance. Claire fell to her knees,